The morning mist clings to the English countryside as the rumble of Pratt Whitney engines cuts through the dawn silence. RAF Molesworth, March 15, 1944, 0630 hours. A battle-scarred B-17 Flying Fortress emerges from the gray clouds, black smoke trailing from its No. 3 engine, flak holes visible along the fuselage like deadly confetti. Before the bomber's wheels even touch the rain-soaked runway, ground crews are already in motion. 23 men in coveralls sprint toward the designated hard stand, their movements choreographed with the precision of a ballet, each knowing exactly where to be and when. The aircraft shudders to a halt, propellers still windmilling in the cold March air. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez doesn't wait for the engines to stop. He's already positioning the fuel truck while his team swarms the aircraft like worker bees on a hive. 9 minutes. That's all they have before this flying fortress must be ready for its next mission. 9 minutes to refuel, rearm, inspect, and send 22 tons of aluminum and steel back into the teeth of the Luftwaffe. 300 miles away, Hauptmann Klaus Weber climbs down from his Messerschmitt Bf 109, confident that the American bombers he just engaged won't return for hours. He has no idea that his assumptions about enemy logistics are about to cost Germany the war in the skies above Europe. By the spring of 1943, the skies over Nazi-occupied Europe had become a deadly chessboard where timing meant everything. The combined bomber offensive, launched jointly by the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces, was grinding German industrial capacity to dust one factory at a time. But the Luftwaffe was far from beaten. German fighter pilots, many of them veterans with hundreds of combat hours, had developed tactics that turned every American bombing mission into a gauntlet of fire and steel. The German strategy was brutally simple and devastatingly effective. Allow the American bombers to penetrate deep into Reich airspace, then hit them with everything available during their most vulnerable moments. Oberst Adolf Galland, the brilliant tactician leading Germany's fighter forces, understood that American bombers were most exposed during their bombing runs, and again during their long journey home when fuel was low and formations had been disrupted by combat damage. German pilots had studied American operations with the methodical precision that characterized their military culture. They knew that Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses and consolidated B-24 Liberators required extensive ground time between missions. Intelligence reports suggested that American bombers needed at least 4 to 6 hours of maintenance, refueling, and rearming before they could return to combat. This knowledge shaped every aspect of Luftwaffe tactical planning. The math seemed to favor Germany. If American bombers launched at dawn, engaged German fighters over the target, and limped home by mid-afternoon, German pilots could land, refuel their nimble Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s in 30 minutes, grab a quick meal, and be ready for another sortie by the time the next wave of American bombers appeared. The Luftwaffe could potentially fly 2 or even 3 sorties against every American mission. Major Wilhelm Batz, a Luftwaffe ace with over 200 victories, exemplified this tactical thinking. He would often tell younger pilots that patience was their greatest weapon. Let the Americans exhaust themselves on the first mission, he would say, then hit them harder when they returned tired and low on ammunition. German fighter squadrons developed intricate rotation schedules that maximized their ability to maintain continuous pressure on American formations. The German confidence was not misplaced. Throughout 1943, American bomber losses were staggering. The August raid on the Ploiești oil refineries in Romania cost 54 of the 178 bombers that participated. The October attacks on Schweinfurt ball-bearing factories resulted in losses so severe that daylight bombing operations nearly ceased entirely. German pilots celebrated each victory, knowing that every American bomber destroyed represented 10 highly trained crew members who would never return. But beneath this apparent German success lay a fundamental miscalculation. German intelligence had accurately assessed American bomber capabilities, crew training standards, and even strategic objectives. What they failed to understand was the revolution taking place on British airfields where American ground crews were rewriting the rules of aviation logistics. While German pilots celebrated their tactical victories, American mechanics were preparing to turn those very tactics against them. The transformation began in the muddy fields of East Anglia during the bitter winter of 1942. Lieutenant Colonel Curtis LeMay, then commanding the 305th Bomb Group, watched his maintenance crews struggle with the harsh realities of keeping complex four-engine bombers operational in a foreign climate. British weather was unforgiving to American equipment designed for different conditions, and treated INL maintenance procedures that worked perfectly at stateside training bases proved inadequate under combat conditions. LeMay was not a man to accept inefficiency. The future architect of strategic bombing campaigns that would reshape warfare possessed an analytical mind that saw problems as puzzles to be solved rather than obstacles to be endured. He gathered his maintenance officers and posed a simple question that would echo through aviation history. Why should it take 6 hours to prepare a bomber for its next mission when the actual combat flight lasted only 8 hours? The answer lay not in the complexity of the aircraft but in the antiquated approach to ground operations. American maintenance procedures had been developed during peacetime when aircraft flew perhaps once or twice per week. Combat operations demanded that bombers fly daily, sometimes twice daily, turning every airfield into a high-speed factory, where efficiency meant the difference between victory and defeat. Master Sergeant Anthony Ricci, a former Detroit auto worker turned aircraft mechanic, became one of the unsung heroes of this transformation. Ricci had watched Henry Ford's assembly line revolution transform automobile manufacturing, and he recognized that similar principles could revolutionize aircraft maintenance. Instead of having one crew perform all maintenance tasks sequentially, why not have specialized teams working simultaneously on different aspects of aircraft preparation? The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity. While one team refueled the aircraft, another could reload ammunition. While armament specialists checked the bomb bay, engine mechanics could inspect the Pratt Whitney power plants. Instead of sequential operations that consumed precious hours, parallel operations could compress turnaround time to minutes. The challenge was coordinating these activities without creating dangerous conflicts or overlooking critical safety procedures. American ingenuity rose to meet this challenge. Ground crews developed hand signals that allowed teams to communicate across the noise of running engines. They created specialized tools that accelerated routine tasks. Most importantly, they developed a culture of precision and speed that treated every minute as a tactical advantage. Crew chiefs began timing their operations with stopwatches, competing not just against German fighters, but against their own previous records. The 8th Air Force leadership recognized the strategic importance of these innovations. General Ira Eaker, commanding American bomber operations in Europe, understood that logistics was warfare by other means. He authorized experimental programs that tested new maintenance procedures and rewarded crews that developed innovative solutions. The message was clear. Every minute saved on the ground was another minute available for combat operations. By early 1944, American ground crews had achieved what their German counterparts considered impossible. They were regularly turning around fully loaded B-17 flying fortresses in less than 15 minutes. More remarkably, they were doing this while maintaining safety standards that actually exceeded peacetime requirements. The secret was not cutting corners, but eliminating inefficiencies that peacetime operations had never needed to address. This transformation was happening at dozens of airfields across England, but German intelligence remained focused on aircraft performance and crew capabilities. They continued to plan their defensive operations based on assumptions about American logistics that were becoming increasingly obsolete. The stage was set for a collision between German tactical doctrine and American operational reality that would reshape the air war over Europe. The human dimension of this revolution was perhaps its most remarkable aspect. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez had never imagined that his childhood spent helping his father repair tractors in rural Texas would become vital to winning a world war. But as crew chief for B-17 Thunderbird, Rodriguez found himself responsible for keeping one of America's most sophisticated weapons systems operational under conditions that would have challenged peacetime mechanics working in fully equipped hangars. Rodriguez and his 22-man crew had developed a rhythm that bordered on the supernatural. Each man knew not only his own responsibilities, but also those of his teammates, allowing them to seamlessly adapt when combat damage or equipment failures disrupted their carefully rehearsed procedures. When Thunderbird returned from a mission over Hamburg with its No. 2 engine throwing oil and flak damage to the tail section, Rodriguez's crew had the aircraft mission-ready in 13 minutes, and 47 seconds. The tactical implications of these human achievements were staggering. German fighter pilots had built their defensive strategies around the assumption that they would have substantial recovery time between American bomber waves. Hauptmann Johannes Steinhoff, a veteran pilot with over 100 victories, later recalled the psychological impact of discovering that American bombers could return to combat before German fighters had completed their post-mission maintenance procedures. The German tactical doctrine called for intensive fighter attacks during specific windows when American formations were most vulnerable. These attacks required German fighters to expend most of their ammunition and fuel, necessitating immediate return to base for rearming and refueling. The assumption was that this would provide adequate time to prepare for the next American wave, which intelligence suggested would not appear for several hours. Technical innovations supported these human achievements in ways that German intelligence failed to appreciate. American ground crews had developed rapid connection fuel systems that eliminated the time-consuming process of manually connecting and disconnecting fuel lines. They created ammunition loading procedures that could fill a bomber's defensive positions in minutes rather than hours. Most significantly, they developed inspection protocols that maintained safety standards while dramatically reducing the time required to certify an aircraft as mission-ready. The contrast with German ground operations was stark. Luftwaffe maintenance procedures developed during the methodical pace of peacetime operations remained largely unchanged despite the accelerated tempo of combat. German ground crews were highly skilled and dedicated, but they worked within organizational structures that prioritized thoroughness over speed. This approach had served many well during the early years of the war when air operations were sporadic and aircraft availability was abundant. Master Sergeant Ricci's innovations extended beyond individual aircraft to entire squadron operations. He developed rotation schedules that ensured fresh crews were always available for critical maintenance tasks. He created standardized toolkits that eliminated time wasted searching for specific equipment. Most importantly, he fostered a competitive culture where ground crews took personal pride in their turnaround times, while never compromising safety standards. The weapons systems revolution was equally significant. American armament specialists had developed loading procedures that could install a full load of ammunition for 12 .50 caliber machine guns in under 4 minutes. They created bomb loading techniques that could configure a B-17's bomb bay for different mission requirements with unprecedented speed. These innovations multiplied the tactical flexibility of American bomber operations while maintaining the rapid turnaround times that gave American forces their decisive advantage. The leadership dimension of this transformation revealed the profound differences between American and German organizational cultures. Colonel LeMay's willingness to challenge established procedures reflected a distinctly American approach to problem solving that emphasized innovation over tradition. German military culture, despite its tactical brilliance, remained bound by hierarchical structures that discouraged deviation from established procedures. General Eaker's support for ground crew innovations demonstrated strategic thinking that extended far beyond individual battles to encompass the entire campaign. He understood that winning the air war required more than superior aircraft or brave crews. It required logistical superiority that could sustain operations at a tempo that overwhelmed enemy responses. This insight drove American investment in ground support capabilities that German planners had dismissed as secondary considerations. The enemy perspective reveals the tragic consequences of intelligence failures that extended beyond tactical miscalculations to fundamental misunderstanding of American capabilities. German pilots continued to plan their operations based on assumptions about American logistics that had become dangerously obsolete. Major Hans-Joachim Marseille, the legendary Star of Africa, had transferred to European operations in 1943 and found himself facing American bomber formations that seemed to regenerate with impossible speed. German intelligence reports from early 1944 reflect growing confusion about American operational capabilities. Luftwaffe pilots reported engaging the same American bomber formations multiple times in a single day, something the German doctrine considered impossible. Initial reports attributed these encounters to navigation errors or pilot confusion, but patterns emerged that could not be explained by individual mistakes. The moral implications of this transformation extended beyond military efficiency to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of warfare itself. American ground crews were fighting their own war against time, mechanical complexity, and the harsh realities of combat operations. Their victories were measured not in enemy aircraft destroyed, but in American bombers returned to combat readiness. These were battles fought with wrenches and hoses rather than machine guns and bombs, but they were no less decisive for being fought on the ground rather than in the air. Oberst Galland's tactical genius had created defensive strategies that might have succeeded against conventional logistics operations. His fighters were positioned to exploit the timing windows that traditional maintenance procedures would have provided. But American ground crews had eliminated those windows, turning German tactical advantages into strategic vulnerabilities. The faster German fighters could return to combat, the more likely they were to encounter fresh waves of American bombers supported by fully operational defensive systems. The technological race between offensive and defensive innovations accelerated throughout 1944 as both sides recognized the decisive importance of logistical efficiency. German engineers developed rapid refueling systems for their fighters, but these innovations addressed only part of the operational equation. American bombers still required time to reach their targets and return, time that American ground crews had learned to use with devastating efficiency. The psychological warfare dimension of this transformation proved as significant as its tactical implications. German fighter pilots began each mission knowing that American bombers they damaged but failed to destroy would likely return to combat before German fighters could complete their own maintenance cycles. This knowledge affected everything from target selection to ammunition conservation, as German pilots realized that partial victories were becoming tactical defeats. The morning of October 14, 1943, began with the same routine that had become familiar to both American and German air crews. At bases across England, American ground crews prepared their flying fortresses for another deep penetration raid into the heart of Nazi Germany. The target was Schweinfurt, home to Germany's critical ball-bearing industry, and the mission would test every innovation that American logistics had developed over the previous year. Oberst Galland had positioned his fighters with mathematical precision. Intelligence estimates suggested that the American bombers would require at least 6 hours of ground time after returning from their first mission, providing adequate opportunity for German fighters to refuel, rearm, and prepare for a second engagement. The Luftwaffe had assembled over 300 fighters along the projected flight path, with detailed plans for multiple interceptions that would maximize damage to the American formations. The first wave of American bombers launched at 800 hours, their silver forms disappearing into the autumn sky above the English Channel. German radar operators tracked their progress with professional detachment, noting formation sizes and probable targets. Everything proceeded according to expectations until the American bombers reached German airspace and the real battle began. Major Wilhelm Batz led his squadron into the American formations with the aggressive tactics that had made him one of Germany's most successful fighter pilots. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 cut through the bomber formation like a knife, his cannon shells finding their mark on a B-17 from the 91st Bomb Group. The American bomber fell away from the formation, smoke pouring from its wing. But Batz had no time to observe its fate as he pulled away to avoid the concentrated defensive fire from the remaining bombers. The engagement over Schweinfurt unfolded with the terrible beauty that characterized air combat during the Second World War. American bombers pressed through flak and fighter attacks to deliver their ordnance with devastating accuracy. German fighters, displaying the aggressive spirit that had made the Luftwaffe legendary, tore into the American formations with desperate courage. When the smoke cleared, 60 American bombers had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair, while German losses included 25 fighters and 17 irreplaceable pilots. Galland's calculations appeared vindicated. The American losses were so severe that continuation of daylight bombing operations seemed impossible. German pilots landed at their bases confident that they had achieved a decisive victory, that would force American strategic planners to reconsider their entire approach to the air war over Europe. The mathematics of attrition seemed to favor Germany. They could replace fighters faster than Americans could replace bombers and trained crews. But as German ground crews began the familiar process of refueling and rearming their fighters, something unprecedented was happening at American bases across England. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and thousands of ground crew members like him were implementing procedures that German intelligence had never imagined possible. The surviving American bombers were not limping home to hours of maintenance and repair. They were being turned around for immediate return to combat. At RAF Molesworth, Rodriguez's crew swarmed over Thunderbird before the engines had stopped turning. Fuel trucks were already in position, ammunition belts were being loaded into defensive positions, and engine specialists were conducting rapid inspections that would have taken hours under peacetime procedures. The aircraft had returned with flak damage to the tail section and oil pressure problems in the No. 3 engine, but Rodriguez's crew had developed procedures for addressing such problems without delaying the aircraft's return to combat. The transformation was happening simultaneously at dozens of American bases across England. Ground crews that had trained for this moment throughout the winter and spring of 1943 were executing procedures that compressed traditional 6-hour turnaround times into mere minutes. The surviving bombers from the morning's raid were being prepared for an afternoon mission that German intelligence considered impossible. German fighter pilots, following their established post-mission procedures, were unaware that their tactical victory was about to become a strategic defeat. They had planned their day around the assumption that they would have adequate time to prepare for the next American attack. The reality was that American bombers were already being fueled and armed for immediate return to the very targets that German fighters thought they had successfully defended. The transformation became apparent to German forces at 13 of 47 hours when radar operators detected a new formation of American bombers approaching German airspace from the west. Initial reports dismissed the contact as a navigation error or equipment malfunction. American bombers simply could not return to combat so quickly after sustaining the losses inflicted during the morning's engagement. But as the radar signatures strengthened and multiplied, the terrible truth became undeniable. Hauptmann Klaus Weber, who had engaged American bombers over Schweinfurt just hours earlier, was still on the ground when the alert sounded. His Messerschmitt Bf-109 was being refueled, and his ground crew was replacing ammunition that had been expended during the morning's combat. Under normal circumstances, Weber would have been ready for another sortie within 30 minutes. But normal circumstances no longer applied to the air war over Europe. The American bombers approaching German airspace were not a second wave launched. Hours after the first, they included aircraft that had participated in the morning's raid and returned to England for what German intelligence assumed would be extended maintenance periods. Thunderbird, with Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's crew chief expertise, was among the returning bombers, her battle damage repaired, and her fuel tanks topped off for another penetration into Reich airspace. German fighter squadrons scrambled to respond to this unprecedented situation, but their carefully planned defensive arrangements had been disrupted by the unexpected timing of the American return. Pilots who should have been rested and ready for combat were instead caught in various stages of post-mission procedures. Ground crews who had planned their maintenance schedules around traditional turnaround times found themselves rushing to prepare aircraft that were not ready for immediate combat. The afternoon engagement over Schweinfurt revealed the full extent of American logistical superiority. While German fighters struggled to achieve the coordination that had made their morning interception so successful, American bombers pressed their attack with the methodical precision that characterized well-supplied and well-supported operations. The ball-bearing factories that had survived the morning's raid found themselves under attack again before repair crews had even assessed the damage from the first bombing. Major Batts, flying his second sortie of the day in an aircraft that had been hastily prepared for combat, found himself engaging American bombers that showed no signs of the fatigue or equipment problems that should have resulted from extended combat operations. His Messerschmitt performed flawlessly, but his ammunition load was reduced because armament crews had not had time to complete their normal loading procedures. More significantly, his squadron was operating with reduced strength because several pilots were still on the ground waiting for their aircraft to be prepared for combat. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots was immediate and devastating. They had been trained to exploit American logistical limitations, but those limitations had apparently disappeared. Every tactical advantage that German pilots had developed through combat experience was being neutralized by American ground crews who had transformed logistics from a constraint into a weapon. The careful timing that had made German defensive tactics so effective was being disrupted by American operational capabilities that exceeded every intelligence estimate. Oberst Galland, monitoring the afternoon's engagement from his headquarters, recognized that something fundamental had changed in the air war over Europe. German pilots were reporting continuous engagement with American bomber formations that should have been on the ground undergoing maintenance and repair. The mathematics of attrition that had favored Germany during the morning's combat were being reversed by American logistical capabilities that German planners had never anticipated. The afternoon's combat results confirmed the new reality. American losses were significantly lower than those sustained during the morning's engagement, while German losses continued to mount as pilots flew multiple sorties in aircraft that had not been properly maintained between missions. The Luftwaffe was discovering that tactical superiority meant nothing when the enemy could return to combat faster than defensive forces could prepare to meet them. As the sun set over the smoking ruins of Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories, both sides began to comprehend the full implications of what had occurred. German intelligence officers would spend the following weeks trying to understand how American bomber operations had achieved capabilities that exceeded their most optimistic estimates. American ground crews, exhausted but victorious, had demonstrated that the war could be won not just in the air but on the ground, where their wrenches and fuel hoses had become weapons as decisive as any gun or bomb. The statistical evidence of American logistical superiority became undeniable in the weeks following the Schweinfurt raids. German intelligence reports from November 1943 documented a phenomenon that challenged every assumption about American bomber operations. American aircraft were flying combat missions at rates that German analysts considered physically impossible given traditional maintenance requirements and crew rest periods. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights over British airfields revealed the extent of American ground operations that had been hidden from German view. Photographs showed American bases operating with the efficiency of industrial facilities, with ground crews working in coordinated teams that could service multiple aircraft simultaneously. The images captured fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and maintenance vehicles moving in patterns that suggested careful choreography rather than the chaotic activity that German intelligence had expected. Major Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most experienced fighter pilots, filed reports that reflected growing concern about American operational capabilities. His squadron had engaged American bomber formations on 3 consecutive days, inflicting what appeared to be significant damage during each encounter. However, reconnaissance flights confirmed that the same American aircraft were returning to combat within hours of sustaining battle damage that should have required days or weeks of repair work. The numbers told a story that German strategic planners found difficult to accept. American bomber sortie rates had increased by over 40% since the beginning of 1943, while aircraft availability rates remained constant or actually improved. This combination suggested that American ground crews were achieving maintenance efficiency that exceeded peacetime standards while operating under combat conditions that should have degraded their performance. German attempts to replicate American ground crew innovations met with limited success. Luftwaffe maintenance procedures had been developed over decades of careful refinement, and modifications required extensive testing and approval processes that consumed precious time. More significantly, German maintenance philosophy emphasized thoroughness and reliability over speed, reflecting cultural values that prioritized perfection over rapid turnaround times. The strategic implications extended far beyond individual battles to encompass the entire German defensive strategy. Oberst Galland's tactical innovations had been designed to exploit American logistical limitations that no longer existed. German fighters were being repositioned to intercept American bomber waves that were arriving with unprecedented frequency, disrupting defensive preparations and creating opportunities for American formations to penetrate German space with reduced opposition. American bomber commanders quickly recognized the tactical advantages that their ground crews had created. Colonel LeMay began planning operations that deliberately exploited German assumptions about American logistical capabilities. Multiple bombing waves could be launched against the same target complex, overwhelming German defensive responses and maximizing damage to critical industrial facilities. The human cost of this transformation was significant for both sides. American ground crews were working at a pace that exceeded any peacetime operations, maintaining aircraft under conditions that challenged both their technical skills and physical endurance. The pressure to maintain rapid turnaround times while preserving safety standards required constant vigilance and professional excellence that few civilian occupations could match. German fighter pilots found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation. They were flying multiple sorties per day against American bomber formations that seemed to regenerate with supernatural speed. The psychological strain of continuous combat operations, combined with the growing realization that German tactical advantages were being systematically neutralized, began to affect pilot morale and combat effectiveness. The industrial implications of American logistical superiority became apparent as German production facilities faced continuous bombing pressure that traditional defensive strategies could not counter. Ball-bearing factories, aircraft manufacturing plants, and synthetic fuel facilities that had survived initial attacks found themselves under renewed bombardment before repair crews could restore full production capacity. By the spring of 1944, German strategic planners were forced to acknowledge that their intelligence assessments of American bomber operations had been fundamentally flawed. The assumption that American bombers required extensive ground time between missions had become the foundation for German defensive planning, but that foundation had crumbled under the reality of American logistical innovation. Generalfeld Marshal Erhard Milch, responsible for German aircraft production, recognized that the Luftwaffe was facing a crisis that extended beyond tactical considerations to encompass the entire German war effort. American bombers were striking German industrial targets with a frequency and intensity that overwhelmed repair capabilities and disrupted production schedules that were already strained by material shortages and labor problems. The ripple effects of American ground crew efficiency spread throughout the European theater of operations. German anti-aircraft artillery, positioned to defend against bombing raids that followed predictable timing patterns, found itself engaging American formations that arrived at unexpected intervals. Flak crews that had planned their ammunition expenditure around traditional American operational patterns were forced to adapt to continuous combat operations that exhausted both equipment and personnel. German fighter pilot training programs, designed to prepare new pilots for combat against American bombers that rated according to established patterns, became obsolete overnight. Young pilots arrived at operational squadrons expecting to find enemies that followed the tactical patterns described in training manuals, only to discover that American operations had evolved beyond recognition. The technological race accelerated as German engineers attempted to develop innovations that could counter American logistical advantages. Rapid refueling systems, automated ammunition loading equipment, and streamlined maintenance procedures were tested at German airfields, but these innovations addressed only part of the operational equation. American bombers were returning to combat not just with full fuel tanks and ammunition loads, but with battle damage repaired and mechanical problems resolved. Oberst Gallen's final reports on the air war over Europe acknowledged that German defensive strategies had been rendered obsolete by American innovations that German intelligence had failed to anticipate. His pilots were achieving individual victories that had no strategic significance because American bomber operations could sustain losses that would have crippled traditional air forces. The mathematics of attrition that had favored Germany during the early stages of the bombing campaign had been reversed by American ground crews who had transformed logistics into a strategic weapon. The documentary evidence of American logistical superiority accumulated throughout 1944 as German forces encountered operational realities that challenged every assumption about enemy capabilities. Intelligence reports described American bomber formations that operated with mechanical reliability that exceeded German expectations, supported by ground operations that maintained aircraft availability rates that German forces considered impossible to achieve under combat conditions. American strategic bombing campaigns achieved decisive results not just through the accuracy of individual attacks, but through the sustained pressure that rapid turnaround times made possible. German industrial facilities found themselves under continuous attack that prevented effective repair and reconstruction efforts. The psychological impact on German civilian populations was equally significant as air raid sirens sounded with increasing frequency, disrupting daily life and undermining confidence in German defensive capabilities. The lessons learned by American ground crews during the European campaign would influence military logistics for decades to come. The innovations developed by mechanics like Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and organizational leaders like Master Sergeant Ricci became standard procedures that transformed not just aviation maintenance but military logistics across all services. The understanding that logistics could be a decisive weapon rather than merely a support function reshaped American military doctrine and contributed to victory not just in Europe but throughout the global conflict. The final irony of this transformation was that German tactical excellence had created the conditions that made American logistical innovation necessary. Without the pressure of continuous combat against skilled and determined opponents, American ground crews might never have developed the procedures that gave American bombers their decisive advantage. German fighter pilots, in their efforts to exploit American weaknesses, had inadvertently forced Americans to eliminate those weaknesses and transform them into strengths. The air war over Europe was ultimately decided not by the dramatic dogfights that captured headlines or the strategic bombing raids that destroyed cities, but by the quiet revolution that occurred on British airfields where American ground crews rewrote the rules of aviation logistics. Their victory was measured not in enemy aircraft destroyed, but in American bombers returned to combat readiness, not in territory captured but in minutes saved and efficiency gained. The transformation achieved by mechanics and crew chiefs represented something uniquely American, the willingness to challenge established procedures and develop innovative solutions to seemingly impossible problems. These men brought the same innovative spirit that had built American industry to the task of maintaining complex military equipment under conditions that would have defeated lesser efforts. Their success demonstrated that warfare in the industrial age would be won not just by brave pilots and superior aircraft, but by the unglamorous but essential work of logistics specialists who understood that every minute saved on the ground was a tactical advantage in the air. The German failure to anticipate this transformation reflected broader limitations in intelligence assessment that extended beyond tactical considerations to encompass fundamental misunderstanding of American capabilities and culture. German military excellence was grounded in thoroughness, precision, and adherence to established procedures, qualities that served Germany well in many contexts but proved inadequate when confronting American innovation and adaptability. The legacy of this forgotten victory continues to influence military operations in the modern era. The understanding that logistics is warfare by other means, that support personnel are combatants whose contributions can be as decisive as those of frontline fighters, and that innovation often emerges from the pressures of combat rather than the comfort of peacetime planning, all trace their origins to the airfields of wartime England, where American ground crews discovered that wrenches and fuel hoses could be weapons as powerful as bombs and bullets.